This is Chapter 21 of Following the Equator. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Following the Equator by Mark Twain, Chapter 21. The Wheat, Keeping Down the Population. Victoria, Killing the Aboriginals. Pioneer Days in Queensland. Material for a Drama. The Bush, Pudding with Arsenic. Revenge, a right spirit but a wrong method. Death of Donga Billy. Man will do many things to get himself loved. He will do all things to get himself envied. Pudd'nhead Wilson's New Calendar. Before I saw Australia, I had never heard of the wheat at all. I met but few men who had seen it thrown. At least I met but few who mentioned having seen it thrown. Roughly described, it is a fat wooden cigar, with its butt end fastened to a flexible twig. The whole thing is only a couple of feet long, and weighs less than 2 ounces. This feather, so to call it, is not thrown through the air, but is flung with an underhanded throw, and made to strike the ground a little way in front of the thrower. Then it glances, and makes a long skip, glances again, skips again, and again, like the flat stone which a boy sends skating over the water. The water is smooth, and the stone has a good chance. So a strong man may make it travel 50 or 75 yards. But the wheat has no such good chance, for it strikes sand, grass, and earth in its course. Yet an expert aboriginal has sent it a measured distance of 220 yards. It would have gone even further, but it encountered rank ferns and underwood on its passage, and they damaged its speed. 220 yards, and so weightless a toy, a mouse on the end of a bit of wire, in effect, and not sailing through the accommodating air, but encountering grass and sand and stuff at every jump. It looks wholly impossible. But Mr. Brock Smythe saw the feat and did the measuring, and set down the facts in his book about aboriginal life, which he wrote by command of the Victorian government. What is the secret of the feat? No one explains. It cannot be physical strength, for that could not drive such a featherweight any distance. It must be art. But no one explains what the art of it is, nor how it gets around that law of nature which says you shall not throw any 2-ounce thing 220 yards, either through the air or bumping along the ground. Reverend J. G. Woods says, "The distance to which the wheat or kangaroo rat can be thrown is truly astonishing. I have seen an Australian stand at one side of Kennington Oval and throw the kangaroo rat completely across it. Width of Kennington Oval not stated. It darts through the air with the sharp and menacing hiss of a rifle ball, its greatest height from the ground being some 7 or 8 feet. When properly thrown, it looks just like a living animal leaping along. Its movements have a wonderful resemblance to the long leaps of a kangaroo rat fleeing in alarm, with its long tail trailing behind it." The old settler said that he had seen distances made by the wheat in the early days which almost convinced him that it was as extraordinary an instrument as the boomerang. There must have been a large distribution of acuteness among those naked skinny aboriginals, or they couldn't have been such unapproachable trackers and boomerangers and wheaters. It must have been race aversion that put upon them a good deal of the low-rate intellectual reputation which they bear and have borne this long time in the world's estimate of them. They were lazy, always lazy. Perhaps that was their trouble. It is a killing defect. Surely they could have invented and built a competent house, but they didn't. And they could have invented and developed the agricultural arts, but they didn't. They went naked and houseless, and lived on fish and grubs and worms and wild fruits, and were just plain savages, for all their smartness. With a country as big as the United States to live and multiply in, and with no epidemic diseases among them till the white man came with those and his other appliances of civilization, it is quite probable that there was never a day in his history when he could muster 100,000 of his race in all Australia. He diligently and deliberately kept population down by infanticide, largely, but mainly by certain other methods. He did not need to practice these artificialities any more after the white man came. The white man knew ways of keeping down population which were worth several of his. The white man knew ways of reducing a native population 80% in 20 years. The native had never seen anything as fine as that before. For example, there is the case of the country now called Victoria, a country 80 times as large as Rhode Island, as I have already said. By the best official guess there were 4,500 aboriginals in it when the whites came along in the middle of the 30s. Of these, 1,000 lived in Gippsland, a patch of territory the size of 15 or 16 Rhode Islands. They did not diminish as fast as some of the other communities. Indeed, at the end of 40 years there were still 200 of them left. The Geelong tribe diminished more satisfactorily. From 173 persons it faded to 34 in 20 years. At the end of another 20 the tribe numbered 1 person altogether. The two Melbourne tribes could muster almost 300 when the white man came. They could muster but 20 37 years later, in 1875. In that year there were still odds and ends of tribes scattered about the colony of Victoria, but I was told that natives of full blood are very scarce now. It is said that the aboriginals continue in some force in the huge territory called Queensland. The early whites were not used to savages. They could not understand the primary law of savage life, that if a man do you a wrong, his whole tribe is responsible, each individual of it, and you may take your change out of any individual of it, without bothering to seek out the guilty one. When a white killed an aboriginal, the tribe applied the ancient law, and killed the first white they came across. To the whites this was a monstrous thing. Extermination seemed to be the proper medicine for such creatures as this. They did not kill all the blacks, but they promptly killed enough of them to make their own persons safe. From the dawn of civilization down to this day the white man has always used that very precaution. Mrs. Campbell Praed lived in Queensland as a child in the early days, and in her Sketches of Australian Life we get informing pictures of the early struggles of the white and the black to reform each other. Speaking of pioneer days in the mighty wilderness of Queensland, Mrs. Praed says, "At first the natives retreated before the whites, and, except that they every now and then speared a beast in one of the herds, gave little cause for uneasiness. But as the number of squatters increased, each one taking up miles of country and bringing 2 or 3 men in his train, so that shepherds' huts and stockmen's camps lay far apart and defenseless in the midst of hostile tribes, the blacks' depredations became more frequent, and murder was no unusual event. The loneliness of the Australian bush can hardly be painted in words. Here extends mile after mile of primeval forest where perhaps foot of white man has never trod. Interminable vistas, where the eucalyptus trees rear their lofty trunks and spread forth their lanky limbs, from which the red gum oozes and hangs in fantastic pendants, like crimson stalactites, ravines along the sides of which the long-bladed grass grows rankly, level untimbered plains, alternating with undulating tracts of pasture, here and there broken by a stony ridge, steep gully, or dried-up creek. All wild, vast, and desolate, all the same monotonous gray coloring, except where the wattle, when in blossom, shows patches of feathery gold, or a belt of scrub lies green, glossy, and impenetrable as Indian jungle. The solitude seems intensified by the strange sounds of reptiles, birds, and insects, and by the absence of larger creatures, of which in the daytime the only audible signs are the stampede of a herd of kangaroo, or the rustle of a wallaby, or a dingo stirring the grass as it creeps to its lair. But there are the whirring of locusts, the demoniac chuckle of the laughing jackass, the screeching of cockatoos and parrots, the hissing of the frilled lizard, and the buzzing of innumerable insects hidden under the dense undergrowth. And then, at night, the melancholy wailing of the curlews, the dismal howling of